Good afternoon. I am Dennis Mitchell, Executive Vice President for University Life. I'm really excited to be here and to really host this first discussion that we've had for this season. Awakening Our Democracy is a series that brings us together as a community to discuss critical issues of our time through conversations with thought leaders, advocates, journalists, and scholars. Today's conversation will be a moderated panel discussion for the first segment, followed by a Q&A session. And we have a wonderful panel of experts whom I'll introduce to you in a moment. First, I want to share a quick word about University Life. As we are a hub of Columbia's student life, we share information, resources, events, and initiatives that support inclusion and belonging, health and well-being, and community citizenship, including many opportunities for students and others across the university to connect and get to know each other. Some logistics for today's program. In terms of questions, thanks to the many of you who submitted questions in advance, we're grateful. If you have questions during today's discussion, please grab an index card, which I'm sure others will pass around, and jot down your questions. And you can just pass them down the aisle to staff members and they'll pick them up as we head into the Q&A segment. And if you're watching via live stream, please send your questions via email to universitylife@columbia.edu. And I'll say that again for those who didn't have a pen. It's universitylife@columbia.edu. This event is being recorded and will be posted at University Life's website within the week. Now on to today's events. And let's be honest, it can be challenging to know exactly how to shape up to being a good citizen. What exactly does that mean these days? Many of you might be familiar with Columbia's Community Citizenship Initiative. It's a program that University Life began several years ago to level set on values around inclusion and belonging, sexual respect among first-year students, both undergraduate and graduate. It's one of the many ways we try to ensure Columbians have a clear sense of what it means to be a good citizen within our university community. But what does it mean to take those same behaviors and that commitment of good citizenship to our online lives, which increasingly is where most of us are spending most of our time? So today we'll dig into some of the complex questions around digital citizenship. What does it look like to meaningfully build stronger and more equitable, inclusive communities online and off? How should we think about online privacy, the rise of artificial intelligence, social media, and the ways in which our choices online impact the world around us and our quote-unquote real lives? What is our responsibility as individuals, as citizens? I'm looking forward to listening and learning from the incredible group of speakers we've assembled here. And I'm excited that we're hosting our first hybrid Awakening Our Democracy, with one panelist joining us from the Bay Area, which is very fitting for this topic. I'm going to share a brief introduction of the panel, but I will say this: we have an extraordinary group with us, and I encourage you to go online and learn more about each and every one of them. Our moderator for tonight is Keach Hagey, an investigative reporter of the Wall Street Journal, where she covers the intersection of media and technology. She was part of the team that broke the Facebook files, which recently won a Polk Award for business reporting. On the panel this evening, we have Jamal Greene, who is the Dwight Professor of Columbia Law, where he teaches courses in constitutional law, comparative constitutional law, and the law of the political process. Jamal is also a co-chair of the Oversight Board, an independent body that reviews content and moderation decisions on Facebook and Instagram. Sandra Matz, the David Zalaznick, My apologies, Sandra. I was close, right? The David-Zalaznick. How's that? Thank you. Associate Professor of Business at Columbia Business School. And she is a computational social scientist who studies human behavior and preferences using a combination of big data analytics and traditional experimental methods. Malkia Devich-Cyril, who will be joining us remotely, is the Senior Fellow and Founding Director of Media Justice. Malkia's work as an activist has championed the media and technology rights of communities of color and other underrepresented groups to demand and win equity in the digital age. And Francesco Tena, who is this year's Obama Foundation Scholars at Columbia University through the World Projects, is the founder of Pipeline to Power, which develops meaningful civic engagement habits in young people so they have access and knowledge to the remaining active and informed residents for life. So without further ado, I'd like to turn the floor over to Keach. Thank you.
Thank you. Welcome, all of you. Thank you so much for taking time to be here. And I'm so thrilled to be here in such august company to talk about digital citizenship, which, I will be honest, are two words that I had never really put together before we started to talk about this panel. But the more I started thinking about it, I realized that this might be a great way to describe my very hard to describe job. I'm a reporter at the Wall Street Journal, and I have one of those beats that if you hang around a newspaper long enough, they let you kind of make up your own job. And so I'd been covered in the media industry for many years, and a few years ago, I went to my editors and said, you know, I would really like to cover the way that these big platforms like Google and Facebook are impacting the media industry, and especially the press. And this work, talking about this concept of digital citizenship, made me realize, like, why is it that I was so interested in that? And I think it's because what fascinates me about that is it asks the question, how do we, as Americans, who have these two concepts of free speech and freedom of the press and free speech enshrined in not just any amendment, right, our First Amendment, like the core foundational idea of our democracy, how do we do the work of citizenship in a world, in an arena that is basically controlled by this handful of large technology companies, like global technology companies. So anyway, it gave some insight to what I do every day, and because I think it's not obvious what digital citizenship means to everyone, I just wanted to begin by asking each of you what this concept of digital citizenship means to you. So Professor Greene, do you want to kick us off?
Sure, I'm happy to get started, and I'll start just by saying I also had not necessarily put these two words together, although I've thought about each of them independently in a number of contexts. When I think of digital citizenship, I think of the kind of rules, principles, practices that govern how we relate to each other within online communities. How do we choose to present ourselves? How do we decide how to persuade others of things? How do we treat other people? How do we consume information? How do we educate ourselves? So the analog being to citizenship outside of an online space, or kind of citizenship in the real world. And I think in both of those contexts, we don't have complete control over exactly how we present within those spaces. We don't have complete control over the laws, customs, norms that govern our participation in those spaces. But at the same time, it's important for us, I think, to take some responsibility for how we treat each other, how we present ourselves, again, how we educate ourselves, how we curate information, and how we engage within that environment.
Great. Malkia, I don't know if you can see me. I would love to know what does digital citizenship mean to you?
Thank you for asking, and I'm sorry I can't be there with all of you, but also I'm happy I didn't get on the plane. So,
Fair.
You know, to keep it 100, I really don't love the term at all, you know? I think to myself, you know, when I ask myself what digital citizenship means, I ask myself, you know, are tech companies good citizens in the first place? The tech companies that are providing these platforms that we're talking about whether or not we can be good citizens on, you know, I find that the companies themselves are bad citizens. They contribute to housing displacement. They contribute to union busting. They contribute to digital redlining, to police surveillance, to anti-democratic activities. So how, in that scenario, when the company itself is a bad citizen, can citizenship or belonging or equity on the platform happen? I think of citizenship, you know, generally refers to the rights and protections that one experiences under the law. You know, our rights and responsibilities, not only to each other, but to this broader entity, you know, in real life called the nation state. Now online, virtually, there is no nation state. There are no boundaries, there are no borders. In fact, the corporate rule supersedes the state in this context. And so I think in that way also citizenship is a poor way of thinking about this question, but I think it's really about belonging, you know, it's really about equity, it's really about safety and dignity in these virtual spaces. And so I think when we think about it that way, more about accountability, more about safety, more about security and dignity and belonging, I think we get to see a different picture of what being online in that way means. It requires, first of all, the accountability of the platform. It also requires us to understand that 9 times out of 10, bad actors, you know, the bad citizens, if you will, they are aggressively nationalists, right? They don't want to be good quote unquote digital citizens. They have a very specific agenda to violate those citizenship rules. So I think, again, I would think about it more around security, belonging, accountability, dignity, rather than just the responsible use of technology by anyone who uses computers.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And Professor Matz, what?
Yes, happy
does it
to.
mean to you?
I mean, I'm a psychologist by training, so I think I'm thinking of it mostly from like, what does it mean to be a digital citizen? And I think one of the things that, first of all, is true is I think we all are digital citizens, right? So it's like you oftentimes, because it's very salient in the media, we think of these big tech platforms of like Facebook and Google and Twitter, and then some people are like, well, I'm not using these platforms, so that's nothing that concerns me. And I think the first thing to say about digital citizenship is that even if you're not engaged in any of these huge social media platforms, is there's just no way for you to not be a digital citizen. If you walked in here, there were at least a couple of cameras that captured you. You're probably using a smartphone that kind of follows you around 24/7. You're probably using a credit card. So really this notion of, well, it's a choice to be a digital citizen in this world, I think that's just not true anymore, which means that it's something that I think we should all care about. And then I think, Malkia, you kind of mentioned this. For me, it has like this offline analog of, well, if you're a citizen of a country, there's essentially certain rights that you have and certain responsibilities. And I think one of the things that we see in the digital world is it's become almost like a responsibility to stand up for your rights, right? Nobody's protecting your rights if you don't ask for them. And I think that's something that the younger generations, I think, are doing a much better job at, just because I think they understand better of what is happening. But I think this is really like a huge shift in terms of taking on this responsibility. And this is like part, I mean, you see this in the analog world too, but I think a big part of the digital world is essentially data is by nature collective. Right, just like if you send an email, it's not just you're sending it to someone, so you also create a trace for someone else. If you post a picture on Facebook, oftentimes there's other people in the picture that haven't given any consent of like what's happening with their data. So because data is collective in nature, I also think that the solutions that we have in terms of taking responsibility will have to be collective, right? So your data isn't valuable unless it's part of a bigger collective. So any solutions that we can come up with when it comes to governments, when it comes to really making the most of the data that we produce, I think they will have to be collective. So it's interesting to think about us as an individual citizen, but then also how can we pool the strength that we have as a collective. I think that's like what I think about when I think about the topic.
Yeah, and that might be a great transition actually to Francesco, who works in some of these topics. So yeah, what does digital citizenship mean to you?
Yeah, I think similar experience to most folks, like the two words together are a little bit of a misnomer for me. When I think about digital citizenship, I think about the responsibility of government and of the state. And I think about what digital spaces are government facilitating. What are they doing? How are they sharing services? And how are they doing so in a way that's transparent, that doesn't mirror some of the worst qualities of the private companies that are doing user engagement, that are doing resident engagement. But I think some of what I heard in the preamble to the panel is, what does it look like for you as a person to show up in digital civic life? And that's, to me, is really, really different. It's about how does what you show up for in person, how you act in person, your values in person, how does that differ than how you show up online, your values online and what you say, right? How different are you when you're face-to-face and having a conversation with someone you disagree with versus when you're online and you have a pseudonym or you can be speaking anonymously? And what are the degrees of disconnection that happen? Are you less empathetic or are you more empathetic? Are you a little more vocal about what you believe in? Are you braver online? Are you braver in person? And so that to me is a lot different from digital citizenship. And the second note that I just want to make is citizenship itself is a term I don't use a lot at work, mostly because what I do is deploy what sometimes are billed as citizen engagement platforms, acknowledging that not the only people we want to engage are not citizens. There are a lot of people that live in this country, that live in this community that are not citizens, and they're also worthy of engagement. So usually I use the word resident, but it's probably a little different in this context.
That is added complexity. So maybe you guys heard Elon Musk wants to buy Twitter. No, it's been very quiet. He's a very quiet guy. And so that's kept us busy at the paper. But I do feel like that action really reveals something about our digital ecosystem. And it really shines a light on one of the core challenges of our age, right? That these digital public squares are controlled by private companies with a fiduciary duty to shareholders to seek profit, or if they are taken private, to one richest man in the world. So I feel like this brings forward a lot of questions. And I guess starting in the same order, I want to ask you, Professor Greene, what do you see as those companies' responsibilities in the realm of digital citizenship? And that's something that everyone here has sort of spoken to, right? Where the companies have these responsibilities. So let me start with that.
So I might start with this term, digital public square, which I resist a little bit, and I resist it in part because I don't know that there is an analog public square, or ever really has been. I think of the public square as being highly decentralized across a number of different institutions. What we're doing right now, right, is part of the public square, but isn't the public square. A town hall meeting is part of the public square, but is not the public square. Our conversations with family members, friends, neighbors, in a variety of civic spaces, again, part of the public square, not the public square. And part of the reason I think it's important to draw those distinctions is because each of those institutions, each of those spaces has its own distortions, or its own particular shape. And when we talk about, to the degree we're talking about Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, Reddit, social media platforms, they have their own fairly obvious distortions as well. There are some things they do well, some things they don't do well. Some of the ways in which they kind of distort the speech environment have to do with their own particular incentives, right? And the fact that they choose to amplify certain kinds of content, but not others, right? And so it's not a kind of neutral space in any sense. They're profit motivated, so they are driven by advertiser revenue. They moderate content in the aggregate rather than as to particular pieces of content or particular posts or particular accounts, and that leads to all kinds of distortions as well. So I think it's important to not think of these spaces as sort of a kind of neutral, valueless space that someone just happens to be controlling. As to their particular responsibilities within that space, I think that I think that companies do have a right. I'll talk in terms of rights for the moment. Do have a right to structure the speech environment in a particular way, right? So, and this is one of the things I would say to Elon Musk. I'd say, look, if it's okay to say, I would like to be a space where people are not behaving aggressively and violently towards each other, or I'd like to be a space where there isn't pornography and spam everywhere, or I think companies do have a right to structure the speech environment. I think what goes along with that right is a responsibility to be transparent about the choices that they make, to be transparent about the rules of the platform, to be transparent about what gets removed, what doesn't get removed, to offer some degree of due process to people who are unfairly treated, to act consistently, to have some transparency around what gets promoted and what doesn't get promoted. So I think of the responsibilities as sort of process-based responsibilities, treating users fairly, and when there are situations in which, because notwithstanding that these are private companies, there are also private companies that are obviously really important in shaping public discourse. When there are situations in which the choices that they're making are causing concrete harms, they have to be aware of that, they have to be transparent about it, and willing to accept guidance about what to do about it.
Yeah. And Malkia, you had been critical of these companies, and I'm curious, how do you see our current model working when it comes to equity specifically, and where do you see it falling short?
Where do I see it falling short? How much time do we have? So, let's just be clear, right? We've seen this same dynamic in in mainstream media, right? That over the last 50 years, corporate consolidation has changed the way our press functions and its capacity to function in its intended form. Now, that's also true, of these companies. I would say this: when technology becomes the neural pathway of democracy, of not just of a neoliberal democracy, when it becomes a neural pathways of a carceral state, when it becomes a neural pathway of an inequitable economy, what you end up with is is a very clear. This is a place where the existing dynamics of power are then replicated online. It's not some other space. You know what I mean? It's not some different, separate and distinct place where we operate. That isn't in real life. It is replicating what's happening in real life, and I think that that's an important piece to understanding what's happening on these platforms. And so the responsibility of companies, think about this, right? These are billionaires. This is the ruling class that is owning these platforms. These are people who became billionaires in a pandemic when regular people suffered and died. That's what we're talking about in terms of the distinction. So you ask me, what is their responsibility? Look, either it's a public square or it's a private square. You really can't have both. And I believe that to be true of the press too. When you have a consolidated market, when you have a consolidated industry, that cannot be equitable. There is no way for that to be equitable. So their responsibility, to me, it's not about their responsibility. It's about our responsibility. It's about the responsibility that governments have to regulate, to constrain, to deal with the reality that a platform run by the ruling class, by majority white men, will never, ever, ever serve the needs of everybody else.
Wow. So Professor Matz, Malkia said neural pathway, and I think it was in a metaphorical sense, but it kind of speaks a bit to your work. So I'm just curious, how are these platforms actually affecting us as citizens psychologically and behaviorally?
I'm not sure if I would call it neural pathways, but it's a nice idea. I'll at some point go into the neuroscience of this, we'll see. No, I think you have the two sides, right? And I think I'm not saying anything new here, but on some level, it's amazing. Like if I think back to my childhood, if I wanted to communicate with someone even in the next village, I'd have to send a letter and it's going to take 2 weeks until I hear back. On some level, it's amazing how it's expanded our horizon, right? Psychologically, I can now talk to someone in Kenya, in the Philippines, in India as a kid. So even the access to information about what the world looks like outside of your little bubble that you grew up in, incredible. I think the problem really is that a lot of the features of these platforms are not necessarily designed to bring out the best of human nature, human psychology, right? As you said, they make it very easy to show moral outrage because you don't necessarily see the person on the other side. So saying something nasty on the internet is just so much easier because you don't have this immediate psychological cost of seeing the other person suffering. And the same is true for negative information, right? So we know that negative information spreads a lot more easily and faster across the internet, not just because the way that the algorithms are designed, but that's also because that's what we look for as human beings. So algorithms oftentimes really just play into the human nature. And then I think coming back to this public square, this is a topic that I care a lot about, is they make it very comfortable for us to be in our little bubble, right? So I don't think it's a public square because most of the time what I see online is completely different to what you see. So if anything, I think they've removed us from like this public forum where we can all talk to one another, and they've put us in these little silos, but we have the impression that it's a public forum, which I think is really difficult because we don't even kind of understand our own limitations in some way. And I think, and this is the cop-out answer that every scientist will always give you, so it really depends on how you use it, right? If you're using it in a very active way of kind of trying to expand your horizon, kind of talk to people, stay in touch with loved ones, can be incredible. We know that it can be helpful for psychological well-being. If you're just passively consuming it, constantly trying to compare yourself to everybody else who's amazing out there and is doing yoga and eating avocado toast and drinking oatmeal lattes, right? Then it can be really difficult for mental health, just because you're essentially now in this bubble and everything else seems amazing and your life doesn't necessarily. So a bit of a cop-out depends answer.
Yeah, and Francesco, as someone who's done some really interesting work exploring open source models, what kind of alternatives are out there?
Yeah, a huge shout out to like the open source Floss Libre community. That's really global, and I think there is so much we can learn from just moving to technologies that are open source, where you can have transparency in the code, where you can inspect, you can see how things work. There are no hidden algorithms. I think so much of maybe the next few years of my work is like auditing and doing an inventory of how much technology that is actually used in government is open source and how much is actually proprietary. I'm very wary of platforms that do resident engagement that are proprietary, that we can't inspect, that we can't see what's happening behind the scenes. So much of the digital platforms that I try to set up for cities to engage residents in is rooted in open source. It's rooted in values of transparency. It was developed by people who were super radical about anti-corruption. And so the platforms that I deploy for cities, the city administrator has super limited ability to take out an idea that they don't like. Like everything is very auditable, everything is very transparent. And that's in such contrast to what we're seeing in the spaces where we engage every day, right? We don't know if we open up Facebook what the layout's gonna look like. And if it's changed, there's going to be a Facebook group that pops up that's like, give us the old layout back, and then kind of dies down at the end of it, because they're really, I think thinking of those spaces as public squares is challenging, because really what it is it's a data suck, right? They're after your data and they want your attention, and that's about it. That's really the bottom line for a lot of these these companies. So when I think about what it looks like for governments and some of these spaces to really rally around some of that transparency and privacy. I don't expect much, but I do, encourage folks to look at open source alternatives. There's, should I shout out some specific ones? I really liked, like Mastodon, I think is the name of an alternative to like a Facebook social media type. I'm weary to shout it out because it's what Donald Trump took and rebranded as his social media platform, which you can do with open source, right? Once you are able to free up the code, it's no longer proprietary, and so you can really truly have quote unquote competition in the market in terms of these platforms. I'll shout one more out, which is like there's a matrix messaging protocol, which I think we're seeing more regulation move in the direction of interoperability. So like everyone knows the whole, if you have an iPhone and you text someone with Android, it's like a green bubble and it's like a mark of shame, whatever. I'm an Android user, love it. And I'm fine with it. But at what point does it not make sense to allow companies to really fence off services that are used more like a utility rather than a premium service? And so there are tons of open source protocols that are trying to solve this issue. Matrix is one of them, if folks are looking at some other messaging alternatives.
Awesome. So some of you sent in some questions as you were registering, and we got some good ones, so I wanted to share a few of those now. One helpful one that's I think a good baseline for all of us is, what are the existing laws regulating social media? Professor Greene, I feel like this one's coming to you as the legal expert here.
Well, it may not take too long to answer this question. I think it's probably easier to talk about this in terms of what are the laws that deregulate social media rather than regulate it. So if we're talking outside the U.S., there are many countries that have laws that regulate social media, and in the European Union, there are laws regulating data privacy. There will be soon likely laws within the EU regulating certain kinds of obligations that social media platforms have to their users. But if we're talking about the U.S., the basic problem with regulation is that when we're to the degree we're talking about how social media platforms use content, in other words, data, there are First Amendment objections to state regulation of those practices. There's a lot of debate among scholars about whether there should be First Amendment objections, whether that's the right kind of regime, whether there should be how much we should be able to regulate the practices of social media companies. But I think the fairly conventional, fairly orthodox view of what the First Amendment permits is direct regulation of how companies deal with content would not be permissible. In addition to that, just to go along with this idea that it's more deregulation than regulation, the most important law governing the content of online platforms. I'll put intellectual property to one side because there are laws dealing with copyright. There are also laws dealing with child pornography, but for most content that we're talking about, Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, which is a law from 1996, is the most important federal law governing this space. And what it says a couple of things, but what it mainly says is that a platform or an interactive computer service that hosts the content that's produced by users is not treated as the publisher of that content for liability purposes. It also means that if they engage in forms of content moderation, if they decide what should stay up, what should go down, if they amplify content or de-amplify other content, that they're not then treated as the publisher of that content just because they've chosen to moderate it in a particular way. And this law was put in place in order to make sure that platforms were not held liable for the individual content of their millions or in some cases billions of users, which would impose lots of litigation costs on the platforms and make it difficult for them to operate. But that was the impetus behind the law. There's lots of people who are mad about this law, who think that it means that platforms are not internalizing the choices that they make about what to amplify, what not to amplify, what to moderate, what not to moderate. So there's lots of debate around it. But the basic impetus, the basic objective behind the law is to make sure that platforms operating at the scale that these platforms operate at are not held liable for the choices of the individual users who use the platform.
Right, so a big loophole, not that much regulation. So another one of the questions that came in was, how can you provide equity in a digital world when some do not have the means of certain luxuries like technology? Malkia, I'd love to throw this one to you.
Well, I think that's a great question. So, equity in terms of the digital world is often framed around access, content, and ownership, right? And in terms of access, which is what I hear the question referring to, there is a huge digital divide, not just so much around hardware and software, but around cost, and the affordability of the technology, which is out of control, as we all know, if you've looked at your cell phone bill lately. So cost and mitigating cost, I think is one significant issue. Another significant issue is, right now, the civil rights and citizenship of marginalized communities is routinely violated and disenfranchised online, specifically, I think in 5 primary ways. 1, through hate and harassment, 2, through online censorship, 3, through disinformation, 4, through the automation of the carceral state and of bias, and then 5, through violations of privacy. In each one of these areas, there are interventions that could be made, to transform this dynamic. Some of those interventions, many of those interventions are interestingly automated, even though automation is one of the arenas for which inequity is significant. I think that, there are so many ways to think about this, but one way is to understand, number one, many of the automation interventions attempt to address, quote, unconscious bias, right? And it's assumed that in many of these arenas that unconscious bias is the culprit. I would suggest that actually it's not that unconscious. The question is it unconscious or is it justified? Those are 2 very different things. And understanding whether it's unconscious or justified will help us to understand whether or not we can use AI effectively to balance the scales, The other piece is their motivation to remove bias, If the bias, so on the surface, there's this motivation to remove bias. Facebook, Twitter, and others have responded, but let's remember, to extraordinary activist pressure. These are not things they decided to do on their own at all, right? This is years, over a decade of activist pressure, which has resulted in the most minimal steps. Now, they might seem huge to them, right? Because they're spending a lot of money, but they're not spending any, it's a drop in the bucket compared to profits. You feel me? So I think that is their motivation to remove bias. Maybe it seems so on the surface, but bias is profitable. More conflict, more clicks. So we have to also understand that we have to create the motivation to remove bias. It's not automatically there. It does not matter what the rhetoric is, right? Whether it's liberal, progressive, or conservative, the fact is that bias, more conflict, more clicks. So those are some of the ways I would think about dealing with equity. Let me say this last piece, which is that equity online and equity offline have a relationship to one another. So when these companies actively displace thousands, hundreds of thousands of people from homes through their build-outs, right? When these companies take over transportation systems, which they do, right? When these companies, allow partnerships with third-party apps, with police through third-party apps to surveil and spy on you, to then ask them to promote equity online when they are clearly not invested in equity offline, there's a mismatch there. And so I think we need to make sure that there's a relationship between equity online and equity offline.
So another question that came in was, how do we digitize the enforcement of the Constitution and its policy-making aspects? So Francesco, I feel like this one is really for you, right? How do we digitize this process?
I can't speak to enforcing the Constitution. I could talk a little bit about digitizing some policy stuff. And I do want to sort of connect this to the last question about, what responsibility do we have to do if we're doing resident engagement, if we're doing policy making using digital tools. There needs to also be an in-person analog version of that. I think what we're kind of ready for is using digital tools that, again, are open source and are transparent and anti-corrupt to hold sort of this institutional memory of even just what's happened. How many times have folks been in community meetings talking about we want to come up with a plan to revitalize this neighborhood, and then someone in the back of the room is like, I've been here for 30 years and I've been in this meeting 5 times in those 30 years where we want to come up with a plan and come up with a plan and come up with a plan. And so using some digital platforms and using continuous resident engagement platforms to sort of catalog, make that information accessible, see what's happened in discussion and discourse in local cities and other forms of government, I think is one thing that we are kind of ready for. And so it doesn't mean that there's a lot of engagement happening, but even just having one place where folks can see, here are the meetings that happened, here's what came out of those meetings, here are some notes, here are some discussion points, here are some ideas, here are the people that submitted those ideas. I think having just institutional memory digitized in that way can be really powerful and can be really transformative. That way, one, you're not gaslighting people of like, I feel like I've had this conversation 1,000 times. And two, you're able to really have honest and transparent conversations about what has already been said and what's changed this time and why are we coming back to the table for this. So that's one thing. I think the other thing that we can do, and what I really like to do is I want to find more people who are in government, who are maybe elected officials, who want to share some of that policy-making power, who want to invite residents to actually meaningfully participate in crafting legislation. We have some form of it in the form of referendums, but I think they can happen much more quickly and much more continuously and much more locally if we're engaging digital platforms to host some of the structures and containers of those conversations and of those processes, and then knowing that we'll also have to design with folks to have more in-person activities that support those same processes as well.
Okay, and how far away are we from being like Estonia and getting to vote from our phones?
I'm so jealous of Estonia. For folks who don't know, they brag that they never collect the same piece of data from you as a resident more than once. Like if they ask you your name, your height, all this stuff, they just have it in this super database. Our digital infrastructure in the US is really far behind, and I think and this is the reason why I didn't even answer the Constitution part of this question, because our Constitution is just so outdated. The framework, our systems of government are incompatible and holding us back in a really big way for reliable resident engagement in a digital realm. Like, if we were to fit some digital solution onto this disorganized system of government that is our Constitution, it would be rife with just tons of like the bugs that we see in programming and programs. There are tons of bugs inherent in our Constitution, and so it makes it really hard to get to where Estonia is at.
Wow. Okay, so the last question that came in advance was, what kinds of human social behaviors have been the most surprising when considering the proliferation of digital media forms in the last 10 years? What behaviors do you think need to be considered when designing for intercultural competence and democratic participation? So Professor Matz, this sounds like a behavioral question, so it sounds like it's for you.
I always get the very fun and light questions, and
Yeah,
I manage to
like-
turn them into a depressing
Yeah.
conclusion. But I think, so I don't know if this is surprising, but one of the big things, like for behavioral scientists and actually neuroscientists, is the one behavior that has changed big time with the introduction of essentially smartphones and social media is sleep. It doesn't sound, so for centuries, right, just sleep patterns were pretty stable. Essentially, people got 8 hours of sleep and they lived happy lives. Because we have social media, we wake up at night, we check our phones, we wake up in the morning, we don't go back to sleep because we check our emails immediately. Essentially, it's the first time in human history that sleep has been impacted pretty badly. And it's the #1 predictor of happiness and life satisfaction. So forget about having a lot of friends, forget about all of the good stuff that you can do on the weekend. Like sleep is the #1 thing that actually makes people both healthy and happy. So I think that was just one thing that I think is surprising, because now the depressing note is I think very little is actually surprising. I think a lot of human nature is being amplified in the digital space, right? So all of the things that we struggle with, whether it comes to living in groups that are similar to us because it's comfortable, or sharing all of these negative sentiments, I think that has just been amplified. So I don't think it's necessarily surprising how people behave online, which also in many ways means that the way that we think about solutions, I think it's very difficult to just put all of the responsibility on burden on the consumer and the user, right? It's like saying someone is trying to lose weight and you put them in a candy shop and now you give them the right to make their own choices. Like they can only pick from bad options in this case. So I think this notion that, I like the notion of it, and you mentioned the GDPR, the data protection regulations in Europe, like California has a more progressive data protection regulation. I think a lot of it is focused on kind of control and transparency, which is a nice idea, but if the ecosystem doesn't work, right, then you're essentially just putting a lot of burden on the consumer instead of saying, well, let's change something about the system, let's take them out of the candy shop and put them in an environment where they can only make good decisions. So I think that's it, because nothing is surprising about the way that humans really behave online. I think we know that if we just let people try and look after their own data, it's just not going to happen.
Now you're making me wonder if this increase in anger that we've seen is not really all just the algorithms, but maybe because people aren't getting enough sleep.
That's true. That's true.
Seems possible. Okay, so now it's time to move to Q&A. So if you have a question, just raise your hand, and then it'd be great to state your name, the school that you're from, and your question. So are there any questions? And they'll bring you the microphone. Right here, yes?
My name's Kevin.
Go ahead and stand up. It might be easier to hear
My name's
you.
Kevin.
Thanks.
I'm from School of Professional Studies. I'm just auditing a class. I'm actually not like a complete Columbia student, but my wife's always teasing me about that. But anyway, I'm really enjoying this panel and what you guys are talking about. I was kind of wondering if maybe we could expand just a little bit on the equity online and the equity in real life. Like that seemed like a big topic that we just, we moved on to the next question. So I was just wondering if that could be unpacked a little bit. Is that possible?
Yeah.
Great.
Malkia, do you want to expand?
I can try. I mean, I would say, when we think about this question of how to disrupt equity, or inequity, online, we have to think about three things. One is, what is causing the inequity online? Why does it exist? And I think when you ask that question, a bunch of things get revealed. One has to do with ownership, who owns the platform and what their interests are. A second thing has to do with users, like who has access to the platform. And so we know that there's a huge digital divide. We know that digital divide, for example, was evident during the pandemic in terms of how students were affected, student learning was affected. We know that student learning in communities of color was pushed way back. Student learning in poor communities and rural communities and native communities was pushed way back because of this lack of access to technology, not just to the hardware, but also to the ability to pay for smartphones, to and to have, for example, we know that, for example, Black users interact on social media, more prolifically than other users, right? And one of the things that means is that many Black users are experiencing the internet through Facebook, for example. They're not getting to experience the whole rest of the internet. They're getting to use, they're getting these data packages that give them access to a few sites and calling that the internet. And that's that, so when you think about something like that, for example, in real life, you have this issue of cost and affordability. Online, you then have people who can only access a few places in order to engage with the digital world. And then in that world, we know that, for example, Black women are one of the most attacked groups of people online. There have been several studies that looked at this already. A study conducted by Amnesty International noted that, for example, Twitter is an extraordinarily toxic place for women in general, but in particular for women of color. These studies have looked at the fact that Black women on Twitter are disproportionately targeted. So you see the continuum on the cost, the affordability issue, the access issue, the treatment in the space that you're in, and in each one of these places, then the disinformation, what kind of information you have access to, on and on and on, the inequity gets compounded, but it starts offline and it moves online. So I don't know if that helps deepen, the question, the answer.
Yeah.
When the pandemic hit, one of the things that we had to reckon with in some of the civic engagement processes we run, where how do we keep this process equitable in a way but still be totally remote, right? We're talking about the first summer 2020, where we want to engage. We ran a process where young people in New York were going to decide how to spend $100,000 to support young people in this moment. And so we had these prompts, we had young people design the process. There was still this question of what does equitable participation look like where you cannot be in person? Because for so long, our solution to making sure folks had access to these processes were to go to where people already are, right? Go to the subway stations, go to schools, go to high schools and be in person and hand these things out directly. It was a very in-person strategy. And so what we ended up having to do was look at really low-tech solutions. And so what does text-based, SMS-based engagement look like? Of course, using open source platforms, but using a texting bot and having, we bought a phone number, we came up with these really great text conversation flows that the young people designed. And so really looking for low-tech solutions doesn't address some of these root issues that Malkia is describing on why these inequities exist in the first place. But it does offer as the more simple you can make your engagement processes and engage people digitally, the more access you're going to see. And SMS is something that you don't have to download and install on your phone. And most people in the world have access to SMS. Let me not say most people, but it is one of the technologies that is most pervasive out there. So that's just another thing I wanted to offer here.
Yeah.
And let me just, I just want to make one last point on that, which is that as an activist too, I just want to remind people that, online, Black activists are being told, we're going to run you over, we're going to shoot you, all of the stuff. And then we witnessed, right, on television, Black activists being run over, or racial justice activists, not always Black, being shot. So there's a relationship between the violence targeting activists, racial justice activists online, and the violence targeting racial justice activists in the street. Go ahead, please.
And it's a slightly different point, but I do think it really nicely ties into the topic of digital citizenship and involving all of us. Because I think if you think about privacy, right, one of the things that I oftentimes hear, and it's engagement with any kind of technology, is that, well, I don't really care about my privacy because I have nothing to hide. And the one reminder, I think, is really that this comes from a point of privilege. If you don't have to worry about your data being abused, that just means that you're in a very good spot, right? If I can predict very intimate things about you from your social media, from your smartphone, from whatever, that could be political ideology, sexual orientation, and you don't worry about this, that just means that, again, like you're very privileged in that sense. That's not true for everybody else. And I think so, even if we think about data and what does it mean to care about some of these regulations, some of these new technologies that we could potentially be using, I think it is a huge question of equity, because it means that we are looking out for other people who are not in the same privileged position of not necessarily having to worry about your data. So it's just something, because I hear it all the time, is I don't have to worry about it. I think it ties nicely into this point that is a bit broader.
Another question here.
Sure. Should I stand?
Yeah, please stand up and say your name.
Hi, I'm Carly. I'm at the law school. I had Professor Greene for constitutional law. I had a question for Professor Greene and Francesco. I forgot your last name, sorry.
Okay.
I was wondering if you could speak to your thoughts on the societal benefits of more or open source code and like empowering individual actors to like own their own online experience in a decentralized way versus having like an oligopoly of bigger platforms that perhaps can be regulated, and the pros and cons.
So I can try to start, and I'll say that, this is, designing these kinds of experiences and figuring out what their costs and benefits are is not my core expertise. But I will say that among the more promising responses to the lockup that social media platforms have on people's online experience is various ways of giving users greater control over what they see, what they don't see, how their feeds are curated, and interoperability is part of this as well, being able to have your data be portable from one platform to another as opposed to sitting in a centralized place. So I think there are a number of advantages and some disadvantages, I think, to that move. One of the advantages having to do with privacy, another of the advantages having to do with just the user experience itself, and having a more pleasant experience for people, and more curated to what they're actually interested in. I think a third advantage has to do with the sort of, I think you have to think about each of the kinds of problems associated with platform content policy slightly differently, but the particular problem of misinformation, disinformation, relies on certain kinds of network effects that can be disrupted if people have a more decentralized experience. I think maybe if I had to think of what the major downside would be, it's that it's a really incomplete kind of solution in the sense that a lot of the problems on platforms are not necessarily problems of direct harassment or someone seeing something they don't want to see. It is often there can be harms that people aren't seeing that are either harmful to them, right? So if you think about doxing, for example, I kind of want to know if I'm being doxed, and not have it be in some other part of the internet universe. Non-consensual pornography, various forms of hate speech are not just harmful to the user experience. They can be creating problems or inciting violence away from your own experience, right? So it's not to say that this is not a good development or that it's not something that we would want more platforms to experiment with. My sense is that it would be a good development, but it's incomplete.
And I see that part of the question was also for you.
Yeah, I think I've talked about why I really appreciate open source technology, and I think there should be, government should use its power to really incentivize it. Like if I was, President of the United States, and I could snap a finger and say, hey, any technology used in government needs to be open source and can only be open source, I would do that in an instant. Right? The government's a huge buyer of and procurer of technology. And so that to me is something that makes a lot of sense and could bolster a lot of these open source projects that are happening and that are really good. But because you have this engine geared towards creating billionaires using tech, and part of that is like, how do you amass users to a critical mass of capturing them in your environment? It's hard to think about what incentives or what business models will actually lead to the adoption of more open source technologies, and also the funding of keeping those projects going.
Yeah.
I know that I wasn't asked, but I finally found an audience to listen, so you're going to hear it anyway. I mean, it's not necessarily open source, but I think what you were mentioning is a technology, and I think that is so true. And I think one of the reasons why we don't talk about these things enough is that because it's a very convenient narrative for Silicon Valley and the big tech companies to say, well, you can either have service and convenience, or you can have privacy and self-determination. And now you pick between the two, and the human brain is always going to go with convenience and service, right? So I think some of the solutions that are out there, some of it is open source, but some of it is also just new technology that says you don't have to send all of your data to a centralized platform for you to get the service, right? So we all have supercomputers in our pockets with our smartphones. So essentially, instead of, there's technology out there where you don't have to submit all of your data for the company to keep it and then secure it and treat it responsibly, but they can essentially just send the models that they're building to your phone, so you get the same experience. It's just that the data never has to leave its safe haven, if you want. And I think that is a big discussion, again, coming back to citizenship, that I think we just have to push for. And we're going to have to push beyond this narrative that is being created of well, you have to pick either or. It's how do we come up with open source or technology that allows you to have both in the best of two worlds?
Yeah. And can the market solve it on its own? That's a good question. Okay, I think we have time for one more question.
So I have one question I'm reading on behalf of Mia, who's a Columbia GS student. And her question is, what would the online world look like if users' information weren't sold? The users have essentially become the product because our information has been constantly sold and traded. So considering as of now, websites can track where you are physically and can have access to Google searches and sometimes access information through microphones, et cetera, what would that look like?
That is a great question. Who would like to take it?
Happy to take a short one. Because I've been thinking about this in the last 2 days very intensely, so this is a great question. I think one of the solutions that we see, and that's because data is collective, as I mentioned in the beginning, is essentially a model that is very similar to small communities and co-ops. So it's essentially you kind of have fiduciary entities that collect the data, and you don't even have to collect it because you can store it locally, but essentially that manage the data of small communities that have a shared interest. So it could be that it's a city who wants to better predict what their traffic looks like, what their investment looks like in different neighborhoods, right? So it's citizens agreeing to having their data being managed by a data co-op that is owned by them and managed by them, and very transparent in terms of what data is used, for which purposes, and it has the best interest of the community in mind. And what that allows you to do is essentially tip the entire balance away from all of the big tech companies holding all of your data, monetizing it, because now you have a lot more leverage, right? So again, your data itself is not really valuable. If suddenly you have 50,000 people, and you say, okay, we're collectively trying to make the most of the data, whether that's monetary or whether that's just generating insights, that is a totally different system. And I think that's what we're going to see, is that we're going to see these data co-ops, these fiduciaries kind of spring up in specific contexts for specific purposes and interest groups, and that will change it pretty radically.
Wow. Well, on that hopeful note, I want to thank you all so much for coming.
Just wonderful. On behalf of University Life, I'd like to give a big thank you again to Keach and to the entire panel for a wonderful conversation. As I mentioned at the outset, each of them is an incredibly accomplished scholar on their own. You can learn more about their work online, so please, please look them up. You can come to our website, you can have access to them there as well. Tonight we'll just touch on the surface of the topic of digital citizenship. We just sort of began for you, and the accompanying questions, opportunities, and challenges that come with that. So I hope you've gained some insight to take back into your own lives as Columbia citizens, both virtually and in your real life. Today's event was part of University Life's calendar of events. To find out more about our programming and other initiatives, please check out our website, universitylife.columbia.edu. And lastly, thank you to everyone who has joined today, here and online. So we're grateful to those of you who watched us online to learn and to share in this conversation. So take care, everyone. Have a wonderful evening, and thank you. Look forward to seeing you at our next event.